Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all tonight to the Measure S Information Summit. My name's Elizabeth Larson, and I'm the editor and publisher of Lake County News, lakeconews.com. We're glad to see you all here. I know a lot of us may not agree on everything, but I think one of the things we all are passionate about is Clear Lake. It kind of binds us all together in a lot of ways. Tonight you're going to hear a series of presentations from a panel. Tonight, real quickly, could everybody turn off their cell phones? Just so that we don't have any interruptions. Thank you. Tonight you're going to hear from a group of panelists from government, education, environmental directors, retired biologists. They have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge about Clear Lake and the issues facing it. We're going to go through tonight's program, which you should have a copy of. We're going to go through their presentations, and afterward, they're going to go into a question and answer session. Now, in order to answer or ask questions, we ask that you contact one of the volunteers who will have index cards. Can volunteers with the clipboards, can you please raise your hand so everybody can see where you're at? You can flag them down, and you can start that right away, or you can wait until later, whatever you're comfortable doing. And those questions, we will submit those to the panelists during the question and answer period. After that, the panel will go through a summation, and we'll wrap up for the evening. So, we're going to begin with District 4 Lake County Supervisor Anthony Farrington, who's going to give the welcoming remarks and an overview of Measure S. Supervisor Farrington.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, each and every one of you, for being here this evening, taking time away from your family and the World Series this evening, so I'll be curious to see how we do. It's a pleasure to stand before you. The summit, as you know, it is a summit for informational purposes, and it's also an opportunity for those that stand against this measure to voice their concerns and their opinions, and that's democracy at its finest. Of course, my intent and my vision tonight for all of us is that while we may disagree, that we're not disagreeable as a community. As many of you may know, that I've been on the Board of Supervisors sworn in since 2001, going on 15 years. I was born and raised here. My family was a pioneer family that came here in the mid-1800s. And it was the lake that brought my great-great-great-grandfather, George Major Hanson, to Lake County. At the time, it was Napa County before we seceded. He left Illinois, where he was a state senator. He worked with Abraham Lincoln in the legislature, came out here, and when Abraham Lincoln was elected, he was the head of what was then known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But it was this lake, it was the history, it was the natural resources that we all grow to love. What I've loved from day one when I was born in Clear Lake Highlands, which is now Clear Lake. When I decided to move back home after receiving my education from UC Davis and entering into politics, when I launched my campaign, and I grew up in the lake, so I may have a certain bias here, but I do believe that the lake is our lifeblood. Whether we use it for purposes of recreation, aesthetics, whether we love the environment, the fisheries, the fowl, this lake is why we're here. And we're surrounded with a terrain that is unrivaled by any other geographic terrain that I've seen in this country. I know when my grandfather located and brought his 9 children here, there was a reason. And I know that each of us, and when we apply decisions at the local level, whether it be the city or the county, that we want to leave Lake County better than how we found it. And we're not perfect, but we do the best that we can. The genesis behind what you see tonight and what we're going to discuss, Measure S, came from a collaborative effort of where we thought about how do we fund our ability to manage Clear Lake, our most precious and treasured resource, and how do we protect it from the dresinids and the mussels. When I was elected, there was no program on the lake. There was no management. There was a lot of committee meetings, a lot of discussions, but nothing was being done. We were looking at undoing and unringing the bell of years of mismanagement where we've located septic systems and poor infrastructure along the lake, had improper phosphorus and nitrogen overloading the lake, which causes the lake to react. So we set a policy going back 14 years looking at best management practices. We brought online the funding to connect the Northwest Treatment Facility here in Lakeport and run a pipeline along the North Shore where we took treated effluent and prevented almost 1 million gallons of hydraulic overloading every year that was entering the lake of sewage, and connected that treatment facility in my district to Clear Lake, and then took that treated effluent up to the geysers where we now create geothermal energy and electricity. Where Supervisor Rushing and I received, on behalf of the board, an award from the Department of Conservation for the Green Energy Award for the state of California. Why that's important is because we're removing the nutrients, the raw sewage, that fuels the algae growth that's so prolific in our community. We've also employed an agricultural element and taken steps towards best management to control the runoff. We've launched and secured funding and moved people out of harm's way with the Middle Creek Restoration Project, where about 80% of the phosphorus and the nitrogen comes into the lake that fuels the aquatic weeds and the algae. In addition, you've seen quite often, I'm sure, wind boats or power boats that are part of the state and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, where they are trying to eradicate the hydrilla, which was discovered in 1994. And to put things into perspective, their efforts still have not been successful. They spend approximately $1.2 million a year trying to eradicate an invasive weed that continues to proliferate throughout Clear Lake. We have about 30 other aquatic species, aquatic weeds that proliferate, and they're getting worse. In response to trying to manage the lake and its reactive condition regarding aquatic weeds, I brought an item to the board that basically would allow us for the first time get the environmental clearance to allow us to actually go on the lake and to manage the aquatic weeds, which are nuisance to many environmental people, recreational people, tourists, etc. I remember going to Kelly Cox and asking him, how can we get the funding to do an environmental impact report, or what we call an EIR, to clear CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act? And Kelly Cox, our former CEO, says, show me the money, and I can get behind it, and hopefully the rest of the board will get behind it. That was the catalyst behind change, where we ultimately revamped and changed our marketing program, where it was a county-ran program, where I personally felt that it was bureaucratic, where I felt it was bloated, and we ended up changing and revamping that program at the time, which was not popular. But in so doing, we freed up the hotel tax money that allowed us to allocate close to $400,000 to complete an environmental impact report that ultimately allowed us to go on the lake and start managing it to deal with nuisance weeds. The problem what we face today is we have only limited tools as to how to eradicate and manage these aquatic weeds. California Department of Food and Ag has tried to say that, listen, the hydrilla is a #1 priority. We're afraid that it's going to translocate or end up in the Bay Delta through the Sacramento River. We're going to continue to fund the program, and we're going to continue to work with local leaders to make sure that we don't quarantine and shut down the lake, which, as you can imagine, would be devastating to Clear Lake, where we would have a lake that would be locked up, that would not be utilized, all in the interest of downstream benefactors, purveyors of our precious resource of water. But we've worked with the state, and it's been a balancing act. And in so doing, we've worked with the state to bring them before our board to where we could actually launch pilot projects, where we could actually put mechanical harvesters on the lake in certain areas where hydrilla has not been discovered. But the state, being very concerned about the fragmentation, translocation of hydrilla, they have required us that if we use mechanical harvesters, that we also must use herbicide application in a lot of those areas, which becomes very counterproductive and costly. About 2005, 2006, our board was presented with a presentation from our staff in the Department of Water Resources, where for the first time our staff said, listen, there is a tide that is moving west, and the tide is involving another invasive species, as if the weeds and the algae was not enough. That through the Great Lakes, that there has been a zebra and quagga mussel that has been introduced from a ship from the Ukraine that released water in the Great Lakes and not in the ocean, that introduced a species that will devastate the ecology, the economy, and the way of life that we know. Now, these mussels may seem trivial because for me, as a layperson and not a biologist, I thought, well, mussels might be a good thing. They're filter feeders. They'll help clear up the lake. Maybe we want to introduce mussels. But if you do a little more research, you'll learn, as our board learned, that the end result in unintended consequences is that you have greater experience of algae, you have greater experience of lake weeds, and you have a decimation of the forage fisheries that affects your total food chain for fisheries. Now, I heard this in textbooks, I heard this from staff, but it wasn't enough for me, so I had to go to ground zero of where these mussels were introduced, and I went to Chicago. And I toured the Great Lakes in Lake Michigan. I toured the water treatment facility that provides water for 6 million people in the city of Chicago. I've talked to their fishing and biologists for the state, and they not once did not have algae. At one time, they did not have lake weeds, and their fisheries and the food web is completely altered and changed. And it was fact, and I was able to confirm the things that I wasn't sure about. This whole journey where we're at today and dealing with Measure S, it became a question of financing. We knew that we needed the act. We knew that we needed to mitigate the algae that many of you have probably smelled, the Lengbia, the cyanobacteria, the nuisance weeds if you use the lake, the complaints that I've received for decades, even prior to public service. We knew that we needed to set up boundaries for protection. And how do we prevent the infestation of this invasive species known as the mussels? But we had no money. And sure, you'll hear detractors tonight, and I welcome those detractors. I think this summit is an excellent opportunity for you to ask questions about where are we, the Board of Supervisors, hiding money. But I will tell you, and you have my word, that this last fiscal year we were looking at a budget deficit of $1.8 million. And if you understand the budget financing and can use of one-time monies versus ongoing monies, you understand that Lake County is not rolling in the dough, so to speak. We have no outside help from the state, no outside help from the feds. And we've had to take ownership, like many jurisdictions throughout the state of California, 58 counties, how to find the financing mechanism to protect our lake from the infestation of the mussels, to manage the aquatic weeds, and to mitigate the nuisance algae. So we looked at raising hotel tax revenue, and the analysis was it wasn't enough money, and we weren't seeing people coming to Lake County anymore as they once were in the 60s and 70s. We provided an analysis of parcel tax revenues, where we'd only have those landowners such as yourself that would pay a tax to fund our program. The cost was too expensive, and it wasn't fair. It wasn't equitable. When the greatest threat were those transient vessels, or those people coming out of the county to use our most beautiful resource, why should we shoulder the burden as property owners? We also looked at vessel taxes, where we would tax, and through special legislation, tax those watercraft such as sea-doos, wave runners, and boats. And that would not raise the revenue, and once again was not equitable, because it would be once again us as a community shouldering the burden where the greatest risk was of those outside users. There's been many statements from detractors about the use of a special district money called vector control. We've even explored that. We've had legal opinions. We've spoken to the board and the director of vector control. And while detractors want to say that you can use vector control money because the mussels is a vector, it's simply untrue. It is not true. It is not a vector. And those monies cannot be utilized and cannot be tapped. Ultimately, where we ended up with was a path of looking at a sales tax. It seemed the most fair, seemed the less costly. And our board purposely made a very intended decision that while we could pass this measure with a simple majority as a general tax, we chose to use a specific tax, which requires 66.7%, a supermajority. And we made that decision to be fiscally responsible, because we know that in times when you're confronted like this year with a budget deficit of $1.8 million, it would be easy to take that $2.4 million to plug that hole. And that's what a general tax would do if we just decided to do a simple majority tax, which this measure would have passed as a general tax. First time as Measure E was 63% of the vote, well above the 50% plus one. This last election, 65.2 as Measure L. And unfortunately, the state has it backwards. A general tax should be a higher threshold than the general tax. And I don't know if we're ever going to see that change. But our board is committed to locking this in specifically for the lake and nothing else. So it will remain a specific tax, and that's the burden that we all have to carry to try to pass it. Our board set aside a few years ago $1.2 million in one-time revenue, and it's important to distinguish between one-time and ongoing expenses. These were reserves. It's your savings account, because we were trying to launch this program, expand our weed eradication efforts, expand and experiment how to deal with the algae, to use booms, to try to move it, to try to take it out of the lake and dewater it. In addition, that funding was used to help expand our efforts to prevent the infestation of the zebra and quagga mussels. We've also recently approved the application of $200,000, which is a drop in the bucket, and many of the detractors will say those grant monies could be used to help fund your program. Well, it's simply not true. Applying for monies as a grant is a one-time expense, and that's how you have to consider it. It is not ongoing revenue. And $200,000 doesn't even come close to covering the expenses that we need for this gargantuan project and program to help mitigate aquatic weeds, lake algae, and prevent the infestation of the zebra mussels. Supervisor Rushing and myself had met with the governor's administration, Secretary John Laird, and Fish and Wildlife Director Chuck Bonham, and we've been very adamant about the necessity to implement a statewide program, going back as far as the Schwarzenegger administration, where we once again rang the bells about the need to provide inspections on the borders coming in the state to prevent the infestation of the zebra mussels. Well, we met with Jerry Brown's administration and his staff. They understand the importance, they understand the significance. In response to that, they offered a pilot project here that ended up going away, the funding, which would allow us to inspect vessels coming into the county through what I call a checkpoint off Highway 20, which is the major artery, as many of you know, connecting 101 and Highway 5. And then also in response, they developed this other confusing sticker program just to raise revenues, to help fund this program to allow certain jurisdictions such as Lake County to access $200,000. This program is defunct, it's not functional, it does not meet our needs, and it's not ongoing revenue to meet our needs in perpetuity looking forward. So in short, there is no state funding, contrary to what you may hear. There is no federal funding. Now, it may be curious to some of you, it's always been curious to me. We are not a Lake Tahoe, never have been, never will be, and that's not the vision here. No, actually, I think our lake's much more special. It's a warm body lake that's available to many people at greater duration throughout the year. It's not as geographically isolated. I mean, we're in bedroom communities that are within an hour away to 2 hours from here. But Tahoe's got something special, though, I guess. Despite the isolation, they received a lot of funding, state and federal. And they have a program that is something that we aspire to have. Now, the director of our water resources, who's present this evening, Scott DeLeon, and I, we did a tour of the program. And they've implemented a program that's very similar to a vision that I have had, to where we introduce choke points or inspection stations at the major arteries or perimeter of the lake coming in and out. And that program is successful because that community understands and treasures and values the natural resource. And I believe that we all do the same. I hope that many of you will agree, if nothing else, that Clear Lake is the lifeblood of this community. And it affects all of our quality of life, no matter what our interests may be, whether it be recreation, wildlife, fisheries, air quality, drinking supplies, property values. And the importance with managing and protecting Clear Lake is that if you are a property owner, you'll understand that it will help appreciate and protect your property values. The negative stigma that we see with the San Francisco Chronicle and the Press Democrat, is very common for them to speak about the window of 2 to 3 months of the year where we are dealing with algae and aquatic weeds, and they leave the other 9 months out, how beautiful this place is, the natural splendor, and how beautiful this lake is, not if you whether you just use it or look at it, but for me, live it. And I know and I believe, and this is a philosophical debate that we can have here tonight at the summit, that I believe if we invest in this lake and manage and protect this lake, that we will grow our economy. And by growing this economy, we will increase our tax base. And by increasing the tax base, we'll be able to provide the public services that are much needed. If you look at the socioeconomics of Lake County, you look at our median household income, it's one of the lowest in the state of California. You look at the prices of our home, the median household, our purchase price of the home is one of the lowest in the state of California. And there's a nexus as to why that's the case. And so when it comes time to check that box, I want each and every one of you to think about that, to really understand why do we have the socioeconomics and the demographics that we're confronted with, and how do we make those changes. But this is not just a financial obligation. You know, and I pulled some numbers out of curiosity that if I may share with you briefly before I wrap up. A lot of sales tax leakage goes out of the county, whether it be Mendocino County, and specifically studies have showed Sonoma County. Santa Rosa's, and maybe some of you know this, our tax rate in the unincorporated area is 7.50, 7.5%. City of Lakeport and the city of Clear Lake's 8%. But our surrounding regions, I think it's important to know because I'm sure many of us are guilty shopping there. And this tax, many will argue, especially the detractors, that it's hard on the low-income people. But it doesn't affect your food and groceries, which many low-income people are struggling to put food on their table. It doesn't affect that at all. It affects those people that are buying electronics, big screen TVs, going to Walmart, Kmart, Costco. And I know many of us are guilty of going to Sonoma and Santa Rosa, but were you aware of really what the tax rate is? How many of you in this room know what the tax rate is of Santa Rosa? Showing of the hands. Anybody? Gentleman in the red shirt, what is it? No, Santa Rosa is not 7 3/4, it's 8.75. That's correct. Good try though, you're close, you're only 1% off. 8.75, Roanoke Park is 8.75. Go to the Board of Equalization website, look at it. We all shop there, we buy the big screen TVs, the cars. Sacramento's 8.5%. Fort Bragg is 8.625%. Sonoma County as a whole in the unincorporated area is 8.25%. Something I think we should all be cognizant. But as I said, as a wrap up here, this is not about a financial obligation for me, and I know it isn't for many members on our panel and those that support this measure. It's a moral obligation. And as I said in my opening remarks, it's about a creed that I think we should all implement, and I think many of us do. And I know that our world would be a much better place, that in an area or community that we live, if we just try every day to do something special, to leave this community better than we found it. And I think the storyline that best resonates with me, going back to the day of my great-grandfather coming to Lake County in the mid-1800s, is that each and every one of us did not inherit Lake County from our grandparents. We are borrowing it from our grandchildren. I thank you all for your time and consideration.
put this down at normal human height so we can speak into this. Jim may need to put it up a little when he gets here. Next up, our next panelist was to speak is Jim Steele. He lives in Clear Lake Oaks. He's a retired biologist, and he's had a long time interest in Clear Lake, and he's going to take you through a slide presentation on Clear Lake's ecology. Please welcome Jim Steele.
Well, now, I can't follow that. No one can, but you may hear a couple of things similar. I've looked at this lake now. In fact, my first job was as a mainframe programmer, and I decided that there was no future in computers. So I went back to school to be a scientist, and for the last 40 years have done freshwater ecology of one type or another, 30 years with the state, and I've worked in almost, I think, every county of the state. I'm almost certain of it. I was a branch chief, and I had a branch full of PhDs and engineers, and so we solved problems much like the one you see here. First time I worked on Clear Lake was in 1976. But Alex Horn was from UC Davis. I was actually here to study impacts at the geysers. And I sat in on their team, and what we all said was, they can fix this lake in 10 years. This is easy. And yet, here we still are. It's a beautiful lake. One of the reasons that there are problems here, you can see it right there in front of you. The two or the two peaks in the background. From our house, we can see about 21 volcanic features. This whole area is full of volcanoes. It produces a lot of high phosphorus soils, about 10 times the national average. So when any sediment runs off into this lake, it contains that phosphorus. We've taken a lot of the nutrients from the sewage, which contains high nitrogen, so the nitrogen cycle has changed quite a bit. That's all been pumped up to the geysers, but the phosphorus remains. So, see if my agreed upon signal was the raise of the finger. There we go. You can see sediment inputs from one storm sequence. This is in 2008. That's enough sediment to actually last for several years as far as cyanobacteria blooms are concerned. The big problem here is not so much the rain and the fact that we now have some really nice grading control ordinances and that sort of thing. It's that it all gets overwhelmed with the large storms. We are going to have more large storm sequences in the future, as most have predicted, based on the global warming, and more droughts. And so there's going to be extreme weather. We have to be able to prepare the land today for those kinds of extremes differently than we thought about how to do it in the past. So we really have to do things differently from the standpoint of management. So this is a tremendous amount of sediment coming in. It's a huge sediment bloom. There's two segments to this. One is from Big Valley to the bottom, and the other is Middle Creek to the top. You can see that Middle Creek, if we were to be able to slow that down, it would make a great difference in the amount of sediment coming into the lake. Right there is a sediment delta. If you were to drive across Rodman Slough Bridge, you'd look out towards the lake. It's even bigger now because the water is lower. But we're basically filling in the lake with sediment. None of that should be there. You shouldn't be able to see it. I remember in '76 it wasn't there. We could almost, I think we could, walk across underneath the bridge in '76. It was a minus 3.5. And that delta was not as large out there. So it is increasing in size over those number of years. This is a cyanobacteria bloom. What happens is that it primarily erupts out of the lake during the summer. It does so because the summer sequences, I have a whole series of slides I'm not going to show to you, but I'm just going to say that the heat in the water column and the low oxygen and the pH drop in the sediments actually cooks the phosphorus out of the sediment, makes it available to the water column. There's anywhere from 150 to 300 metric tons of phosphorus in the water column during the summer, creating the cyanobacteria bloom. This is all pushed to the east from the west, and you can see that the cities of Clear Lake and Clear Lake Oaks take a tremendous hit from what comes blowing to them from the west. This is a false color image showing cyanobacteria taking over the entire lake in July of 2011. And so with the heat in the water column as high as it could be and a lot of phosphorus, I have some false color images of phosphorus as well, showing a tremendous bloom of phosphorus that leads to this cyanobacteria bloom. This is a classic single species takeover. When you teach your course, this is what you show. And, you know, when you're in lake ecology, you say, all right, when something really gets the upper hand, it likes the pH, it likes the temperature, it likes all the phosphorus, and it's the right species at the right time. Wow, it'll take over the whole lake, and yes, it does. And sometimes all the species are balanced, and that doesn't happen. And the reason that you get this yin-yang between one species taken over or a lot of species well-balanced is because the lake itself doesn't have all the features in it that it used to have. This cyanobacteria blooms, I've heard this over and over, they're normal. Well, yeah, they're normal, and you get a few that maybe you won't even see, and you can even see them float by a little bit. But this is a different state of normal, where they encrust the surface and take over the entire surface. This is Lingby of a couple of years ago, and when it dies, it stinks, and you get this aroma of sulfur in the air. Now, this is a lake that is quite a bit larger than ours. Ours is 65 square miles. This one is 10,000 square miles. This is Lake Erie. Lake Erie had a pollution problem a few years ago, back in the 60s, and they were losing their fishery, and so they spent millions of dollars cleaning up the pollution that was coming in from factories and off of the farms. Everybody pitched in. Lots of money there was taxes that were gathered so they could afford this, and the lake improved and the fisheries came back. Then in 1986, they got the mussels into the lake. First it was the zebra mussels, later the quagga mussel, and they're both very related. They're from the Bug River in the Black Sea of Europe. So as Tony said, they were from ships, freshwater ship to freshwater lake, and then it was dumped, and we got the mussels there. Now the entire lake ecosystem has changed, leading to the same situation we have. Tremendous cyanobacteria blooms, and now their water column is loaded with cyanobacteria they have to treat for their water supply, and they can't get the taste out. They have a brand new normal, and they don't know how they're going to get anything changed here because they can't get rid of the mussels, and they still have more phosphorus in the water column, and it doesn't go anywhere. It stays there. Then they can do anything with. This is the other thing that happens. This is not our lake. This is a different lake, and they have a lot of nutrients. They have clear water from the mussels, and what happens, the water is very, very clear, and then the weeds grow up off the bottom. We get the weeds growing off the bottom for a different reason right now. If we can keep the mussels out, we can actually change the lake ecosystem a little bit. That will help us keep the weeds out. So there are some changes that can be made. Here, they can't do anything about this. They've got a tremendous amount of biomass that they have to pull out of here every single year. Now, what they're doing with this is they're recycling it for fuels. Now, rural counties, I'm going to change the theme here a little bit. The rural counties, and I've worked on all of them, and they all have the same theme. Their economies depend on their natural assets, and we're no different. If it's extraction, then it's timber, it's mining, it's water, it's power. If it's food, then it's ranching, it's agriculture. If it's recreation, it's the lakes, the ski slopes, the fishing, the hiking, the resorts, the view shed. You can see where we fall in this. If it's transportation corridors that just happen to fall where the county is, then they get a little boom from food, shelter, fuel, and trade. And so from that list right there, you can see what our greatest asset is. We got to protect, we have to restore, we have to manage. You've got a lake in your backyard, whether you want it or not, and we haven't done very much with it. The county has tried a lot of different things to manage it over the years, of the 60 to 100 years, that there have been problems around the watershed, 450 square miles, which drains into the 65 square mile lake. There have been a lot of problems which created this situation during that same period of time, at least the last 60 years. There's been a whole new set of facts and new sets of limnology studies that have taught us how to deal with lakes. So now we have knowledge about how to do things that we never had in the past. All you have to do is bring it here and use it. And so it's expensive to take care of a natural lake properly, but it's high in cost and lost opportunity cost, high in your future if you don't take care of it. You're going to get this worse than you ever thought it could be if you get the mussels here, and you're going to continue to get it in these cyclic blooms if you do nothing. It's a natural lake, and Clear Lake is our greatest natural asset and economic generator for the county. Everybody knows that. It can also be our greatest economic anchor. Just read the newspaper of the surrounding communities. All they have to, every time we get a bad bloom, and we have some people here with a spoiled vacation, they get on the internet now. So that's a whole new ballgame as far as information is concerned. Presently, there is no revenue source strictly dedicated to Clear Lake for restoration, protection, and management, an ongoing dedicated source just for that purpose. And that actually has to happen if you're going to use any of these techniques that I'm talking about. And 80 to 90% of the wetlands and tule rim land has already been lost. That has to come back. Certain percentage of it has to come back. Middle Creek will bring a lot of it, but it has to come back around the entire lake. And then upland sedimentation is high. This is actually more than it should be. If we were to restore Middle Creek right now, we would still have the problem of the sedimentation being trapped in there, and before long it would neutralize that, so we have to get into the upland. We have to do some work there. The invasive species risk is high. It's high everywhere in the world, and I belong to the North American Lake Managers Society, and so I get this information all the time. The whole world is coping with this. We actually have a little advance on them. We've already have 30 years worth of studies here and understand how the lake works. So Clear Lake is at a crossroads, so we should change direction. Protection example. Quagga zebra mussels, it's a new threat because they attach with what's called abyssal thread. You can see it kind of laying out to the side. This thing is a ½ inch long. It's about as big as your thumb. And they reproduce a lot. You're going to get from this little mussel right here about 1 million offspring and a good lake that's warm water. Gee, we got a warm water lake. So we can expect with our high nutrients, they're going to be very, very productive here. This is a shopping cart that was in the Lake Mead for about a year, and you can see that they attach to hard surfaces and it coats the entire shopping cart. So any structure is going to be loaded with these things. Now they have the quagga, so they're a little lower in the water column. If we got both the quagga and the zebra, we'd have them throughout the entire water column. This is an intake screen before they colonize, and this is an intake screen for a large dam 1 year later. And so all your water pipes are going to have these guys in it. And of course, they're going to be filtering the water. It'll be cleaner. But then they exude what's called pseudospecies or feces onto the ground, and that is high in phosphorus. That actually fuels the next cyanobacteria bloom the following year. So what are some of the long-term projects proposed by Measure S? Well, S can actually have a lot of different approaches to solving this problem, but just as a few. For protection, you have to have boat inspection problems around the lake or in choke points or wherever they are, but still welcome the visitors so that they can get here and they won't want to go somewhere else. That's very important. A lot of people tell me that, well, we have more competition now from other lakes around us, and boats can go elsewhere. Well, they're coming here this year because we have water and the drought lakes don't have water. They're coming here for other purposes such as bird watching and fish species and numbers that don't occur in those other lakes. A natural lake is just a tremendous place for all of these things and for people to come for a destination economy. Restoration, the Middle Creek Wetland Restoration Matching Fund will not go forward unless the county can come up with $6+ million. And by the time this all happens, it might be as much as $8 million. Management, state-mandated nutrient monitoring. We still haven't done it yet, but we have to. We have to be able to, we're under a state mandate to do this and actually control our nutrients coming into the lake, so that has to happen. Monitoring is where it's at. You get a lot of finger pointing. They did it. Those guys did it. Well, we have to find out who does it, and we have to help them do better. Restoration, tule, shoreline, wetlands, and creeks restoration projects. We now have an endangered species, a threatened hitch on the lake. Actually, the hitch we can restore the hitch and bring them back, and we can bring more money in. If we are actively doing this, there'll be grant dollars coming for the hitch and help us to do some of this stuff, particularly in the streams, which we need to have. Management, matching funds for upland erosion reduction grant projects. When you can do the matching funds, the money will come here. You know, right now we can't do the matching funds for the Middle Creek project, and if you go for other grants, you're going to have to still solve that problem because they know we're not doing anything about matching funds there. Management, again, the best management, BMP, best management practices support for land managers. This is done just about everywhere else. If you're in a neighborhood around a lake and you want to know how to take care of your yard or tractor your farm or whatever it is, there's BMP programs with the counties and the state that actually help you do it the right way. We've got a lot of this around the rest of the state. We don't have to reinvent the wheel at all, but we do have to bring it here, and it requires an active program so we can monitor and see who isn't doing it right and we can help them out. So we can all live within our means. We don't need Measure S. I heard that. Well, yeah, that will require a reduction in services because it's going to have to come out of the general fund. You're going to have a limited advancement in the invasive species protection programs, if any at all, and right now you have no idea how at risk you are. I could go through the numbers, but I just want you to know that having looked at this over a number of years now, we are extremely at risk for the quagga and zebra mussel compared to the other lakes simply because we have the kind of nutrient base here that they like in the warm water. And coming from the warm water lakes from the south, they're going to be all set up genetically to be able to make the transition. And so Middle Creek will be delayed, and the outlying areas will be affected by the poor economy, and I think people have already seen that. So how much will it cost? A $10 shirt costs you a nickel. And groceries, gas, medicine, there's no additional tax. This is the fait accompli right here. I only have this up here just to mention in passing. I actually have been a manager of a dedicated fund for the state, multi-millions of dollars per year. It was for coastal stream restoration from tidal and oil tax money, and $15 to $40 million a year, depending on how much was coming in. It was a dedicated fund. And it didn't have half of the straitjacket controls that Measure S has. I mean, this thing is really tight. So when people talk about dedicated funds and they say that they don't trust the government, they don't know what they're talking about. The government people would go to jail if they did anything other than spend that money exactly where it needs to go. There's expenditures are audited annually. Wow, that's almost unheard of because now you got professional audit to tell a Citizens Review Committee and the Board of Supervisors what it all means and where it went. I mean, there's two professionals talking to each other in the lay public, and you got the press right there to see from the transparency side what is said. And then you have a 10-year sunset clause. After 10 years, if you haven't done your work, it goes away. So if it was a bad idea, it goes away in 10 years. And believe me, it won't be a bad idea. And then the measure is intentionally written with flexibility to provide options for the various programs. Somehow that seems to fuel a lot of critics. No, you absolutely need that or you can't get anything done. And then the funds can only be spent on the programs listed in the measures, and the funds cannot be diverted to the general fund. And that's been the problem for a lot of people. They don't know the difference between a dedicated fund and a general fund. So a destination lake requires active watershed management. You can't leave this thing alone in your backyard. Otherwise, you won't have any control over its direction. And today, we understand a lot of management techniques that will make it a better place going forward, because you have to do this the same iterative way that got you here. Little baby steps at a time, going forward. In a few years, it'll all turn around, and it'll be a new normal that everybody can live with. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Just a quick reminder, if you want to submit a question for the question and answer session at the end of the panel discussion, please contact one of the volunteers with a clipboard. We're going to ask them just to raise their hands. They've got clipboards with index cards, and so you can submit your questions for consideration. Next up, I'm going to welcome Supervisor Denise Rushing. She represents the North Shore District 3. She's nearing the end of her second term on the board. She's going to discuss lake health, human impacts, and influences. Please welcome Supervisor Denise Rushing.
Thank you. We'll start by saying, I love this lake. And I know that anybody who has spent any time here does too. I was really touched by the prior presentations, and I know that I'm going to be very interested in the ones that follow, so I will work to keep mine short. I'm going to talk about the heart of this, the why. First of all, Clear Lake is the oldest lake in the Northern Hemisphere. It's one of the most biologically diverse lakes in the world. It is an amazing jewel, and you'll hear more about that soon. As many of you know, my background before entering into public office has been in high tech, but also in ecological design and in permaculture. And there's a saying in the ecological design circles that your watershed is your lifeboat. And I would like everyone to just take a look around. These are the people that are in the lifeboat with us right now. Who knows what's going to happen with the national economy? Who knows where things are going? What we do know is that we are in this lifeboat together. This means in the face of climate change, economic difficulty, including potential downturn, a community's health, both the health of our people and the health of our economy, is really directly related to the health of our watershed. And the dominant feature in our watershed is there for all to see. And I believe it's been speaking to us for some time. If you believe our lake needs help, you're not alone. For over 140 years, in fact, the history of Clear Lake can only be described in the last 140 years as an environmental tragedy. So in the last 140 years, we've seen a series of damaging activity. And that number 140 I find very interesting because that makes us the 7th generation having to deal with all of the decisions that have been made up to now. Decisions like grading, decisions like subdividing and land use, decisions like damming up creeks and undamming them, decisions that have seen the removal of 90% or so, 80 to 90% of our wetlands around the lake. So if those 7 generations ago had understood, who were making those decisions, had understood the lifeboat that we face, I mean, I, for one, am not real happy with some of those decisions that were made at that time. So let's look at the time that we're in right now. I personally believe, and this is why I ran for office, I don't consider myself a politician. I never have, and I've been in office 8 years. It's been an interesting ride. And I will say that the reason I ran is that I believe that this generation, is at a pivotal moment in time. The decisions that we make, Measure S being one of them, the decisions that we make today will set the course for future generations. We have an opportunity at this moment to turn it around in a decade. We can invest in this lake and its people, because I don't separate the two, and we can turn it around. Or we can just go along and say, you know, we can't afford the half cent. So what I'd like to do is just kind of highlight that, shine a light on that moment that we're in, and say, in a decade, what could be different if we do this? We've heard some of it already. What could be different if we don't? It may be absolutely nothing that will be different, except that we'll end up with a quagga in the lake, probably for sure, if we have no program to, and you know, or we reduce services to the point where our safety is impacted around Lake County, and we've closed our libraries and other things that are funded by the general fund, and we devote it to those ongoing funds to the lake instead. And not that the library makes a whole, I mean, the library is not even a fraction of what we need, and we wouldn't have those. And so the things that make this place important and livable for its citizens, we start shutting those down and focus on the lake so that the future generations can have an economy. We could make those decisions, or we could spend the half cent. So we're fighting the symptoms a lot, as you can see in this lake. We're fighting the symptoms, but we also have some root causes, and I will not go into all that the prior two speakers have gone into, except to say I believe we have a moral obligation to restore those wetlands, to improve the ecology of the lake now. Restoring the wetlands is vital. You saw the satellite image that was shown of the nutrient loading, that 60 to 70, maybe more % of the nutrient loading in the lake comes through the Middle Creek system. And that Middle Creek wetland restoration is the project that will happen whether we do it or not. Nature will take back those lands, and those levees will be breached if we do nothing. There are still a few people in harm's way, and certainly if it's done in an uncontrolled way, there will be environmental damage to our lake that I, for one, don't want to be witness to. And things like, if the levees were breached tomorrow, if we had an extreme flood event and the levees were breached, which they almost were a couple of years ago, we actually had people in waist deep in water sandbagging a possible levee breach. And if it had broken then and the lake had flooded those lands, there are underground storage tanks, there are all kinds of things there that you don't want to see that happen. So it would be important that that happen in a controlled way. And if it's done in a controlled way, it can be done in such a way that will improve the economy of the region dramatically. Now, I've mentioned that we're in a pivotal moment in time. I want to share some thoughts around Measure S itself. And only to say that it is very, very, very easy to defeat a ballot measure like this. There are people who can find anything wrong with it. It's very easy. And there's three ways you do it. One is you drum up distrust of government. You point out things that should have been done differently in the past, which are not hard to find with 20/20 hindsight. Two is you suggest things that should be done instead, even though they may not even be remotely possible. And three is you tell people that it will cost them money. So I'd like to address at least a couple of these. One is the distrust of government. And I'll just say this is from my heart. The members of this Board of Supervisors, whether you trust them or not on any other issue, on the issue of Clear Lake, this board has tried its best with very imperfect information. The information gets better over time, but the information has not been perfect. And this board wants for Clear Lake and for the people of Lake County the best and healthiest lake possible. You can believe me or not believe me, but I believe that government can be trusted. And with all that you've seen that is built into this measure, certainly there will be plenty of watchdogs. The second is suggesting what should be done instead. Anthony has already addressed most of those issues, but I will say that there is nothing that has been suggested that should be done instead that will work in the near term, if in the long term. So it will not be, and this is the moment. This is the time when we can do something. And the third is telling people that it will cost them money, and particularly playing on the fears of those who haven't got money, but do have a vote. And what I'd like to suggest there is this. And I did a bottoms-up analysis personally. I said, well, you know, I care a great deal about people who cannot afford everyday necessities and whether or not they can afford Measure S. And as it turns out, if you do a bottoms-up analysis, I did two. I did one for the average Lake County income, and I did one for the low income threshold. For the average Lake County income, if you're at the average, there's just as many people above as below, and you take out what it costs for things that are not taxable, food, transportation, etc., services, your average tax bill under Measure S works out to be around $35 a year. If you go with the low income threshold and take out the necessities of food, transportation, medicines, etc., and assume that the rest of it, or most of the rest of it, is taxable, you're somewhere between $15 and $20 a year for Measure S, a year. And I would say for those who care about low income in Lake County, I want to put this in perspective for you. $15 to $20 a year adds up to be somewhere in the $100,000 range of the tax that's going to be collected. If you want to put that in perspective, there are 1,200 families in Lucerne who are paying $2.7 million a year extra in water bills. And they are all those members, the town of Lucerne is just a couple $1,000s above the poverty line. So if you want an issue, if you really do care about the poor in Lake County not paying extra, that would be an issue I would suggest you work on. And $1.7 million goes out the door every year out of Lake County for that one. So I'll wrap it up by saying it's our time. We need to do this. If you love Lake County, the economy of this area is impacted by this lake profoundly. A healthy lake will also be healthy people. A healthy lake will also mean we pay less in water bills. I can only imagine what's going to happen to the community, and excuse me if I get a little choked up here. I can only imagine what's going to happen to the community of Lucerne if that water plant has to start dealing with the quagga mussel. It's a moral obligation. We need to pass this Measure S, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Our next presenter will be Sarah Ryan. Sarah is the Environmental Director of Big Valley Rancheria. She and other tribal environmental directors have really been leaders in understanding the lake and its unique challenges. She's going to be speaking about water policy priorities and processes. Please welcome Sarah Ryan.
Good evening, everyone. Oops. So who's got the score? 2-2. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. I've been honored to work for Big Valley Rancheria for about 14 years, and it's been an amazing experience where I have had the opportunity to learn about how to balance taking what you need and giving back. And Clear Lake is definitely the lifeblood of the people, and the need for the fish and the tules to be prominent and healthy and not contaminated, the need for there to be enough water so that and clean water so that ceremonies can be done properly and people feel safe in the water. It's extremely important. The need for the birds to be there, the types of birds that are needed for the regalia, the other foods that come from the lake, those are all extremely important. And even the tributaries that feed Clear Lake, if they run out of water or there are diseased fish in it or other water quality problems that are happening in the creeks, that affects everything. So in heading the environmental programs for one of the 7 federally recognized tribes in the county, I get to get my hands wet, literally, on a pretty regular basis. And our programs at Big Valley are based on the desire to protect the natural resources that the tribe considers their own and something that they're responsible for. But it also we actually look at not just Big Valley land, which is 350 acres, or the little bit of shoreline at Big Valley, which isn't very much, but we actually look at the whole lake because of the water currents in the lake, because tribal members go all around the lake, because there are Pomo families from the 23 or 24 Pomo tribes in Lake Mendocino and Sonoma. They all come out to Clear Lake to gather tules, to attend dances, to be part of ceremonies. So it's a requirement, it's an obligation, as many people have been saying, a moral obligation to make sure that the resources, the water resources, the natural resources in this county are safe and healthy and are thriving. So it's not just enough to have a little bit of tules left. We need to get all of those tules back, all 100% of the tules that used to be there. So in having to be a part of the management of that, of course I've had to look at what the existing management and the past management of the lake. And those of you who know me or who have served with me on committees or in the type of work that we're doing to protect the environment, know that there are times when we have to point out issues that we disagree with in terms of what the county does. Despite that, I have to tell you that Measure S is incredibly important to me and to many people I speak with. And before it was Measure S and it was Measure L, same thing. So I've actually served on both committees, and I've given of my time, just like everybody else on the committee, because, and we're a varied group of people who wouldn't necessarily normally work together on things, but it's because we're committed to this. And I'm sure those of you who are against Measure S are also passionate. But I want to point out that each and every component of Measure S is something that this watershed needs. And so I want to talk a little bit about our programs at Big Valley and why I see that every single one of these components of Measure S are important in order to save the lake, and that we have a moral obligation to act at this point because we definitely have problems, not just the fact that we have not enough toolies, but the cyanobacteria and the cyanotoxin issues that we're dealing with even right now as we speak, that I've been actively involved in monitoring. If we have a dedicated lake program, a dedicated watershed program, we will be able to face these challenges and have the money needed to face these challenges. The programs that we have at Big Valley, you know, we probably some of you saw in the news that said, oh, these tribes received, close to $1 million to deal with environmental programs or environmental issues. The numbers weren't exactly right. They were previous years and this year and whatnot, but our programs are about a third of what the county has for a watershed program. So for the little bit that we're technically responsible for at Big Valley, we have almost a third of the money that the county has. And so what I'm saying is the county does not have enough money to be able to do a good, responsive program. And after looking at it, after being involved in county advisory committees and the Quagga Mussel Task Force and being involved in all these issues, I can say sincerely that more funding is absolutely needed to be able to do this right. And when I started working at Big Valley Rancheria, I said, we're one of the only tribes on the shoreline that have a shoreline with a clear lake, and it's the largest freshwater natural lake in California. We need to have a kick-butt program. Our program needs to be responsive, it needs to be big, it needs to be able to meet all of the issues at hand. And I think that this county needs that too. And the thing that's holding it back is the lack of funding for it. You can't count on state or federal grants to be able to do that. I know I write grants. I have to write grants to keep myself employed. So it's hard to get, they're extremely competitive, and the sources of grant funding is just when it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. If you try to run a dedicated program that's responsive to the conditions in this lake on grants, you're going to be going gray early because you're going to be worrying. You won't be able to fund everything you need. So Measure S has as one of the components a water quality program. And within the text of the ordinance, it says that here are some things that could be funded by this as part of the water quality program. And let me point out that everything in the measure is a suggestion for each year. It is a 10-year tax, and it sunsets after those 10 years, and there's no way that it could continue unless the voters brought it up again. Now, personally, I think it should be, something that we keep permanently, but that's just my own personal opinion, because I'm very passionate about the need for good funding, the right amount of funding for the largest natural freshwater lake in California. But in any case, what is written in the ordinance are suggestions that are based on the need that we know. And I can tell you that, as a water program manager and an environmental programs manager for another government, that when you know what you need, you've kind of calculated it out. You've figured out what it's going to cost to do it. You know the personnel you need. You know the equipment you need. You know the supplies that you need to do it. So when you look at the ordinance, which is on the website for Save the Lake, it's savethelake.info, and we have copies of materials out in the front that has website address on it and info on it. But when you look at those items that are in the ordinance, these are just suggestions based on what the needs that we know are for the lake. So water quality monitoring is one of them. And I can tell you that, we do a lot of water quality monitoring at Big Valley. And we are now also doing water quality monitoring along the shores of the lake for cyanotoxin issues. And these are things that right now the county has not been able to afford, but they need to happen. One of the things you can tell with monitoring and basically taking water samples and sending it to a lab, or having equipment that you put in the lake that can give you readings right there. We have a hydro lab at Big Valley Rancheria. It's an $8,000 piece of equipment, but you can also send samples to a lab and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and that's what you need to do for each sample. But those measurements and those lab sample results will tell you something about that water, and it'll tell you either we've got some pollution issues here, we've got something that is affecting the water quality. Because the way that US EPA looks at water quality, they look at the physical, the chemical characteristics of the water. Is the pH in the right range? Is the temperature in that right range? It also looks at the physical characteristics of the habitat. Does it have the right plants growing? Does it have the right, is it a shoreline that is healthy and has not invasive species, but it has native plants that are growing in there? And it also looks at the biological characteristics of the system. And that means, do you have the right insects in there? Or is it all slugs and gnats and leeches? And there are ways to assess your water quality based on each of those components. So when we do water monitoring, we look at those too. So I just want to point out a little bit about why water monitoring is something that will actually guide lake managers to make good decisions about what happens on the land. When we look back at what has been allowed, what's grandfathered in right now, we've got a lot of septic tanks that would never be allowed anymore on the creeks or on the shoreline, but they're grandfathered in. We have a need to see where pollution is coming from in order to make some adjustments on the land. So water quality monitoring is an extremely important, it's the most important part of identifying your needs and your hot spots and what things need to change on land. The next thing that this program covers is the aquatic invasive species. And as everybody who has spoken on the panel before myself has said, that is basically about the quagga mussel prevention program. And within the quagga mussel prevention program that exists right now, there are some vulnerabilities that those of us who have worked on it through the Clear Lake Advisory Committee or the Invasive Species Council that's happening in Lake County, we have seen some weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the program that are really things that are going to be that are hard to fix. But having some form of some additional funding and additional support for the quagga mussel program is what we need to do. We've gone 95% of the way. We need to go that last 5%. There's been a lot of effort by all of the different screening locations and inspectors that are happening in the county in this program that has developed and been refined over time. We need to give it another push to get it all the way there, because frankly we can't count on the state to do it. Every program in other water bodies is different for the quagga mussel program, and some of them some lakes and water bodies don't even have a quagga mussel program. And as has been mentioned earlier, they're marching northward. They marched west from the Great Lakes, and now they got into California in 2007. Now they're marching northward. We need to have a good, strong program that will be effective and prevent them from getting here, because if they do get here, there are economic and environmental impacts that we don't want to have to face. The next part of Measure S, that why I'm so supportive of it, is the nuisance weed and algal programs. And we have weeds on this lake, and they're not. They're here to stay. As you have different ways to manage weeds. These weeds were brought in, and now they're affecting tule growth on the shoreline. Those of you who have seen primrose growing from the shoreline know that it displaces the native plants. There are several ways to control weeds. One of them is chemical control. If you know me personally, you know I don't like pesticides. So over at Big Valley, you know, the tribe is also very protective of their water quality and children swimming in the lake and people using the shoreline and the water. And so we've found a different method that we've been doing quite a bit, which is manual harvesting. So basically removing the weeds by using pools, you know, pool skimmer type of things. And we compost those weeds. And we've actually sent it to a lab for nutrient analysis, and it's 80% nitrogen. So it actually is an excellent fertilizer, and it could be a cottage industry for anyone who wants to do it. Maybe, you know, Big Valley is going to do it. But you don't have to, you know, so that's one of the things, and I know that this year the county has had to go with chemical treatment of various boat lanes on Clear Lake. And in previous years, that was really all that was considered was chemical treatment. And I was really happy to see that the existing department with Scott DeLeon as head of the department looked at other options. And for several years, they were using mechanical harvesting, which is basically mowing it. You do have to do some chemical treatment afterwards to make sure the fragments that, you know, that are from the mowing don't turn into more weeds and more infestation. But the amount of herbicides that have been used on the lake have reduced since the mechanical harvesting was brought in as an option. My understanding is that this summer they couldn't do it because there was a lack of funding for it. They had to go with a cheaper program, which is chemical treatment. So, you know, if you have the right program and you have enough funding to do it, you really do have options for what you can do for weed control. And, you know, there is chemical treatment on the lake that the county is responsible for, and that people hire pesticide applicators and get their permits from the county. There's also, as was mentioned earlier, California Department of Food and Agriculture. They're the guys that are out there in the airboats for the most part, and they are doing surveying for hydrilla. The hydrilla program is very expensive. It controls it to some extent, but you know, they had a protocol which they've changed because of how things are happening on Clear Lake. They ended up almost seemingly eradicating it, and then it came back full force, and now they're out there surveying more and treating it for longer periods of time. So, you know, we also have herbicides going into the lake because of the California Department of Food and Ag program. But my point is that weed management is a big deal, because not only does it affect recreation, but if you have too many weeds going in there, you are going to have fish kills, because you end up reducing the amount of oxygen in an area. So at Big Valley, we actually kind of allow some primrose to stay along the shoreline because it's a great habitat for crayfish, and people like to eat crayfish. But we don't take it all out. We don't cut it up and remove it carefully, but all the way back to the shoreline. But we leave some of it there. So there's a wide variety of programs that can be done with weed management, but you have to have the funding to do it, or else you're going to pick the cheapest option, which is chemical control. The thing about chemical control is you're killing the weed, it falls to the bottom of the lake, and then it becomes food for next year's cyanobacteria, you know? So it's also filling in the lake. So let's look at options like mechanical harvesting or manual harvesting to be a source of weed control. And that is something that has been part of the county's program because, when they have the right funding for it. So that's another reason why I'm for Measure S. And finally, within the ordinance that the money can be spent on is also algal control. So cyanobacteria, and you saw some slides of it, is something that we're all probably familiar with. It's disgusting, and it has affected people's ability to safely go in the lake and to even want to be near the lake and be on the shoreline. And the way to solve that problem is nutrient control. So the amount of erosion that's going on that feeds, that adds phosphorus to the system is something that needs to be controlled through land use practices. So this measure actually has short-term fixes of weed management. That's just a short-term fix. There's no solving anything there really. But there's also watershed restoration projects that are part of this program, which means that we're actually going to be doing things that limit the amount of erosion happening and nutrient loading that's happening in the lake, which means we are going to see cyanobacteria blooms go down and reduce in scope and the length of time that's happening. It's extremely important because I can tell you, coming from working for the tribe, that we have, there are ceremonies that happen where you have to go in the lake at a certain time. You have a religious obligation, spiritual obligation to be at that lake in a certain time, and I can't, so when that was happening this year, we were just this month we were doing cyanotoxin testing to see what the levels were in the areas where they're going, and so absolutely take that seriously. And without the right amount, without funding to be able to do the water quality monitoring that you need, which is basically just giving you information, but also to do the watershed restoration projects that you need, such as putting in tules, replanting in areas where you have basically bare ground and slopes that have very little, stoppage of the flow of soil and nutrients into creeks or the lake. If you don't have that, then you're going to continue to have water quality problems that affect your ability to use the water safely, to enjoy it, and to also see the economic benefits from being able to, to draw tourists. The tribe I work for has a marina. We have a lot of boating that happens there. And, certainly there's, who wants to have the boating traffic disappear? There's a need to, the boaters do bring some, and the tournaments do bring some money into the county that many people benefit from. I also think that I just wanted to point out that we have a responsibility to do things for this lake so that the people who get their drinking water from the lake are not seeing the costs that they're seeing and having the risk that they have because of the cyanotoxin issues. So if we don't do anything and we basically hope for funding and maybe we'll get a grant or maybe we can switch money from one source to another and maybe it'll happen, that is something that we can't really take that risk. But the small amount of funding that it's going to cost per person because of the tax is going to be realized in a big way in terms of the big impacts of on the lake. And I hope that those of you who are on the fence can look at that and say, we have an obligation to improve the lake, and we have a potential source of funding that can be used for good activities, for short-term fixes that we can realize the benefits right then, and long-term solutions which will better our lives in the long run and the lives of our children. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I introduce our final panelist, just a reminder, if you have a pressing question for the panel during our Q&A, again, our volunteers with clipboards, please flag one of them down. There's a bunch of them over here. If you guys can raise your clipboards and just let people know where you're at. So our final panelist is Dr. Harry Lyons. Some of you may even have taken a class from him at Yuba College's Clear Lake campus, where he's professor of biology. Has an incredible knowledge about this lake. He's also a very entertaining educator and speaker. And he's going to give a summary about Clear Lake's future. Please welcome Dr. Harry Lyons.
In October of 1965, I entered a lecture hall at Rutgers University. I was late. I hadn't done the reading. The professor, who was a small, loudmouth man like me, said, "It is violently green, paradoxically shallow, easily mixed, remarkably productive, and seemingly eternal." I turned to the fellow next to me, and I said something that my students say in my class every day. I said, "What the hell is he talking about?" What was he talking about?
Clear Lake.
He was talking about Clear Lake. And then he said something that will come in handy tonight. He said, the future of such eutrophic lakes for the people who live along them is discretionary. And I turned to the fellow next to me and I said, what does that mean? And the fellow was right, rough, but he said, it's up to you, man. Discretionary means subject to our own judgment. If something is discretionary, we use our discretion to do what's right. And Measure S allows us to do that. I wanted to address Measure S as a scientist, the 4 basic ideas behind Measure S. Are they scientifically sound? And I can do so objectively because I have tenure and because my only constituents are populations of zooplankton. First, I have to tell you that the long-term future of Clear Lake, if we do the right thing, is of making a setting for an emerald. I call the lake an emerald, but its setting is chipped. It needs more wetland, more floodplain, more tule, willow, cottonwood, cattail areas. It needs a lot of that. And we can start that process. In fact, it already has begun. There's been a lot of work done on the streams. People have mentioned past work. It's important to realize that people have been working very hard on what is the slow fix. And I've been selling the slow fix, and so have these folks, for years. So the first component was the Middle Creek Project and paying our share. When someone told me that the Army Corps of Engineers was going to build a wetland, I just about fainted. In my childhood, they built dams and conduits and made creeks flow faster, carrying more nutrients into natural bodies of water. I find like saying, what have you done with my Corps of Engineers? Where are they? They're here, and they're doing the right thing. Phosphorus is one of the most immobile nutrients that plants need. It attaches to sediments and silts and soils and living material, and it stays there. Where phosphorus sits, it tends to sit. So this helps us if we build a trap. And the trap in Middle Creek will be the most beautiful trap in the world. There'll be birds and cottonwoods and otters and beaver. It'll be fantastic. But all I will see, because of my constituents, is a phosphorus trap. That's what I want. That's what we'll get. That's what Measure S will pay for. It's a big part of the slow fix. The second part is the mandated water quality programs. Now these are science at its very best. Science has its moment of excitement, but most of all, science is the gathering of data in a systematic way that you repeat over and over again. I would love a job where it's one damn thing after another. But science, this kind of science, the monitoring science, is the same damn thing over and over and over again. It is tedious, it is humdrum, but it is essential. We need a baseline, we need to know what's going on with the lake, and we need to show the state and the federal government that we are serious about being bored to their benefit and ours. Next, reducing the impact of noxious algae and weeds. This involves opening boat lanes, public marinas, and people's eyes to our collective action and doing something. This is where you wake up one morning and you're full of testosterone and you want to take some action. Build a boom, cut some weeds, make sure you take the weeds that you cut out, and aerate the plankton. This allows us to control some extent of the odors. I have begun to think about the algae, the noxious algae, the way I felt about my Uncle Bruce. I did not love my Uncle Bruce, but I fought hard to keep him alive because I knew if I didn't keep him alive, he would smell worse. If you keep the algae alive with booms, cutting, whatever you need to do, it is going to make it more fun to be on Clear Lake, even in a localized location. So here's what's important. Melissa Fulton taught me this. She said, people have to keep having fun. You're not going to buy into this unless you have fun on the lake, at least once in a while. And so these immediate measures of booms and algae and mitigation are very important. Alex Horn, who studied this lake for so long and so well, taught me that if you move that noxious algae out of the way, or you cut those weeds, you'll see that between the living organisms, between the teeming plankton community that I've always been fascinated with, you just slosh that stuff out of the way for a moment. The water is clear. It really is a clear lake. In between the stuff that is crawling and growing, it is very clear. So I was thinking of Alex Horn because I called some colleagues in the Great Lakes. I wanted to know about the fishery impacts of the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels. And I said, I'm Harry Lyons from Yuba College in Clear Lake, and I had some questions about fishery implications of quagga mussels. I waited 3 days. Nobody called me back. So I got on the phone, and I said, this is Alex Horn from the University of California at Berkeley. I wanted to ask some questions about fisheries implications of the quagga infestation, especially in Lake Erie. 20 minutes later, I had 3 calls. In the interest of Clear Lake, I'll be anybody I have to be. On the final exam in Ecology 10, I asked the students, quagga mussels and zebra mussels are re-engineers. They re-engineer ecosystems. How do they do it? I was expecting a 100-word essay response. Mostly I got that. But one student wrote the very simple truth in 2 words. They suck. Yes, they do. And they do it in such a way as to aggravate the problems that people face in eutrophic lakes. The quagga mussels take a huge tax on the plankton system, not 0.5%. They take 50%, 60%, in some cases 70% of the little plants and the little animals that fire up the rest of the food chain. And they do this without and refusing to take the noxious cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. When there's a chance for the blue-green algae to bloom, the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels shut down. They wait for the tasty stuff that is the base of the food chain that leads to a lot of the interesting fish and bird life on our lakes. So they are diabolical. And they choose what they will digest. They have a plumbing system that involves an inherent siphon. The inherent siphon can go to their stomachs with the material that they catch on a mucus net. But if they don't like what's in the mucus net, they throw it out and don't pester their stomachs with it. I want that. The older I get, the more I want it. Okay? Just for cocktails. So they take in this material, and what they jettison without really digesting it, they don't want it, is called pseudofeces. Okay. Again, my students thought this was ridiculous. Dr. Lyons is talking about feces, and he can't even talk about the real thing. Okay? They're very efficient, and the real feces is a minor constituent of the problem. But the pseudofeces has a lot of organic matter in it. It's got phosphorus in it, and the organic matter rots. And when it rots, it uses the oxygen on the bottom, and the oxygen on the bottom declines. And when oxygen declines, phosphorus is released from organic matter and from the sediments. So what you get is situations in the western Lake Erie where you have 1,000 times the phosphorus release. Now, I personally don't believe that, okay? But I am not going to impersonate Alex Horn again to find out from some investigator. So this is this incredible setup of re-engineering the ecosystem. The pH drops, but the clarity goes up, and this is what is amazing to me. I'm from New York, and it's hard to fool New Yorkers. But New York was fooled by the quagga mussel and the zebra mussel that came before it, in that the clarity of the lake went up. Lake Erie became clearer than it had ever been in the history of recording clarity of the lake, because the quaggas were sucking up all this zooplankton and phytoplankton I like to study. It was clear. In other words, you didn't have to swash anything away to see what Alex Horn had suggested was there for me to see. So that was a while of enjoyment. But then what happened is, as Jim has suggested and described and showed in pictures, is that eventually the blue-green algae come, and the quagga don't eat that. They just help it get more phosphorus. So it's important to block these foreigners. They're lined up. After the zebra comes the quagga, and after the quagga there comes the round goby, and then there is the blood-red shrimp. And they're always looking for the next great place. And for once in your life, you can hope that Clear Lake is not the next great place. And you have a chance to do something to make sure that Clear Lake is not the next best place. My Uncle Bruce eventually did die, and I'll give him a lot of credit. He didn't smell that bad. But suppose he left me an emerald. Suppose he left me an emerald. And I know more about jewelry than I want to know because I have a wife who loves rings. And she has taught me about settings. You put this emerald that is Clear Lake, and in the next years, the next decades, what you do is you fix up the setting, the streams that are on the edge, and the wetlands, and so on and so forth. You make the setting better and better and better. If my Uncle Bruce had left me the emerald chipped in a bad setting, I would ask you, what kind of uncle would leave me a ring like this? And my students that are here, they know where I'm going with this. What kind of uncle would leave you a lake like this, an emerald in a bad setting? We have a chance to do something that's not very political. It's more ethical, if you ask me. But again, I'm not so sure. One thing is for sure. Where we need a dedicated stream of money from dedicated wallets behind dedicated rear ends attached to dedicated brains that are data-driven. To me, that is paradise funding. When you vote, whether you vote and whether this wins or whether it loses, if you vote for it, I consider you super. You may not be the super majority, but you are super, and I thank you for being super. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons. Okay, now we're going to go into the question and answer session. We've had a number of questions that have been submitted. You can still submit questions. Just flag down one of the volunteers with a clipboard. And so we're going to start, and you can direct your questions to the panel or individual panelists. It's up to you. So the first question comes from our last speaker. We're going to start with Dr. Lyons. This one's for him. The question is, I have heard that the fishing gets better after mussels get into the lake. Is this true?
Yes. Can you hear me? It does get better initially. And the reason is the transparency of the lake goes up, and also the aquatic weeds proliferate. And I've heard fishermen on Clear Lake say that the weeds are good for fishing. If that is so, then after the quagga, you'll get this huge transparency increase, which helps these weeds, and they grow like crazy and create wonderful fish habitat. But at the same time, the zooplankton and the phytoplankton that feed many of the important sports fish is being depleted. The word that they use in the Great Lakes is food chain stripping. And so what I was trying to do in that phone call was to find out if there were fish that were benefited by the quagga. And the best thing that the person could say that I talked to was, well, the yellow perch aren't doing too badly. And I looked for walleye, which is a big important fish in Lake Erie, and it's had its troubles. The person who asked this question needs to call a fisherman in Lake Erie and Lake Havasu and these other places where the problem exists. It might be that the fishing does improve for certain species, especially those species that live and feed on the bottom. But I would not put a bumper sticker on saying, friend of quagga, and drive in Cleveland. I can tell you that. So you have to do some research. I tried to help you. I didn't get much information out of the folks in the Lake Erie region, but it may be that certain species of fish are benefited. I don't know.
Thanks, Dr. Lyons. Next question is for Jim. Question is, I've heard Jim Steele talk about adaptive management. What is that and why is it important?
Yeah, adaptive management is kind of a go-to approach for managers who have very complex ecosystems that they're trying to change, and it works for in Fish and Game. It worked for the managers that were in very complex wetlands, and they were managing duck habitat and that sort of thing. So they would make a small change, and they would see how the change affected the habitat. In a lake ecosystem, you have a monitoring feedback loop, and as you make changes, you see how the changes would actually affect your feedback loop. You have to have small controlled areas where you can actually see this happen. So for us, we would look at it from a phosphorus lockup rate adaptive management scheme, for instance, where you look at how much phosphorus is actually coming up out of the sediment into the water column. Then you would try to find out what the concentrations of phosphorus were that were going through the dam system. And if it's in the water column and it goes out through the water or the dam system, then there'll be less phosphorus coming up out of the sediment. So if you're reducing the sediment coming in, there's the phosphorus that's coming up out of the sediment into the water column and going out the dam, you actually have a rate of loss. And so your adaptive management scheme would be telling you you're going in the right direction because you have less sediment or less phosphorus in the water column from year to year. That's just one example, but there's hundreds of different ways that you do adaptive management. There are books written on it, and actually there's schools of thought now about adaptive management. It became very popular with ecosystem managers because it was a way they could do something small and move in a direction and get a feedback. But you have to use the systems that are established, and there are books. So whoever asked the question, there is a body of work out there.
Thanks, Jim. Next question is just general, so I guess you guys can decide who answers it. Why not use money gained by taxes to develop aquatic weed harvesting machine that works more effectively? Stop using herbicides and use weeds for fuel and fertilizer. Okay.
I guess I have to put my engineering hat on to do this. As many of you know, the Board of Supervisors has funded with one-time monies a number of what I can only call experiments as to how to actually harvest algae in particular. And it would be an understatement to say that they pretty much failed. Those experiments, there were a lot of ideas as to how to do it. The challenge is it's expensive, and the dewatering process is really super inefficient. And so that said, I've heard a rumor, and it is just in some ways a rumor, that you know, there's companies that have come in and offered to take on the task of putting money in and creating these, I guess, a plant that would harvest, et cetera. So this is where I put my engineering hat on. The capital investment that's required to do such a thing is substantial because there isn't algae on the lake all year round, and there's not weeds available all year round. And so you have to cover that capital cost in a very short period of time. And if anyone has approached the Board of Supervisors in the past, and I think there may have been one or two instances, their idea wasn't to fund it. Their idea was to have the county fund it. And if we had had that kind of money to fund it, there would probably be other projects that we would do instead, including Middle Creek wetland restoration. So There's never been anyone that's come in and said, oh, we're going to put a plant here and we're going to fund it entirely and it will, make a lot of money in fertilizer and everything else. That said, and we'll get back to appropriate technology, hand harvesting and creating compost actually does work. It's an individual effort, but people hauling things out of the lake and putting them on the land to compost, the water kind of drains out all by itself and you get nutrient-rich soil. So that's a possibility.
Sure.
I just wanted to add to Supervisor Rushing's statements that there's two kind of technologies that I think you can respond to the question, and she's focused primarily on the algae, and it's true that we were in a kind of trial and error phase, but the technology exists, and you can see the technology in Klamath Lakes where algae, blue-green algae, is actually harvested as a food supplement where it's non-toxic, and it's not rocket science. It exists. It just requires the capital and investment. It is true that Lake County is cyclical, so that fuel, if you will, or that the algae is not there year-round like in the Klamath Lakes, and it's also toxic. So, there's two things that get kicked around for decades about Lake counties. One is we've owned the water rights for years, and somehow the previous Board of Supervisors lost that. That's a legend. It's not true. We've never owned the water rights to Lake County when I refer to appropriative rights. I'm not talking about littoral or riparian rights. The other legend that you hear quite often is that Japan or China came to the board and wanted to harvest our algae and we shot them down. Well, I tell you, that is also a legend and it is a fallacy. It's fiction. Any organization or any group that wants to come here and harvest our algae, we will be welcoming them with open arms, I assure you, as long as you don't eat it. The reality is with the harvester is that technology is proven. You don't need to improve it. With aquatic weeds, it's there. It's like a lawnmower. The key is to contain it, to prevent the fragmentation or translocation of these aquatic species. We worked very hard to allow the California Department of Food and Ag to work with us. I requested an item with our board support, and I believe Scott DeLeon was on the board or closely in that same time period with the Department of Water Resources, where we did a pilot project in North Lakeport. And the reason that they had prohibited and not allowed us to use the mechanical harvesters is because the risk of coming across hydrilla and further spreading the hydrilla. In fact, we had a constituent, which is now my district in Soda Bay, where he purchased a harvester about $100,000 plus, and then they discovered hydrilla that same year and shut him down where he couldn't use it. I also have another constituent in North Lakeport that fabricated and made a harvester that wasn't able to use it in a lot of locations. But we've partnered with CDFA. We've brought harvesters on, and the economies of scales are there. They're very comparable to that of herbicide application, but what makes it go up in monetary levels is that running the harvester with state approval will require treatment with herbicide application after that, and that's where it gets costly because you're doing dual treatment.
Thank you. Either Tony or Denise might want to take this next one. Why aren't boater fees already collected used to prevent quagga mussels?
Well, we are collecting boater fees, and that's tied to the sticker program. The sticker program, in all candor, it's a porous program. You heard Sarah Ryan talk about it. It's a program that we've put our best foot forward with a limited source. And if I understand the question, the stickers that we pay are for allowing to launch the vessels, both for locals and transient vessels and watercraft coming into Clear Lake. The other discussion is, and I don't know if I glossed over this, we looked at a lot of financing mechanisms, but launch fees at the ramp is something that we didn't really create enough revenue to allow us to do what we wanted, and we believed, I think politically, that it was a deterrent to actually getting people up here. And kind of with the caveat on the same vein is you'll see a lot of people talk about getting, locking up the ramps. And I want you all to be aware that nobody's locking up Clear Lake. Worst case scenario, there could be a quarantine, and we can shut down the entire lake, and that's what we're trying to prevent. But we've looked at launch fees, we've looked at the stickers, which boaters have to procure and purchase along with the state program, but the viability of just launch fees does not generate the revenue necessary when you have a 650 plus private launch facilities, and then I think it's 14 or 18 public facilities, launch facilities. You're not going to get the revenue necessary, and I don't know if Supervisor Rushing wants to add to that.
Well, I would like to add one point. Out of the $10 fee, if you bring your boat and you're trying to get a sticker to launch and you pass the risk evaluation and you're allowed to launch, it's a $10 fee. And if you're a local boater, or if your boat is registered in Lake County, then you pay that fee once a year. If you come from outside the county and your boat is registered outside the county, it's a $10 fee every month that you're here. So out of that $10, $7 of those dollars goes to the screening location to cover kind of the hassle and the time that it takes to screen the boat and to manage the program within your screening location. And $3 goes back to the county. And that when the program first started, it was switched. It was $3 to the screening location and $7 to the county. And the county decided to switch it to make it $7. And so that's, when you, I think there's, 7,000 stickers or 9,000 stickers, somewhere in that range that are sold per year in the county, and that's definitely not enough to run a quagga mussel prevention program.
Thank you. Next question. Why can't we get federal money to help?
I will start with that one, and I imagine others can participate. We are getting federal money to help, and state money as well. It always requires a match. And ideally, we will have the Army Corps of Engineers here designing a project and implementing the project. So there will be federal money. I have talked with Congressman Garamendi, who was intimately involved with the protection of Lake Tahoe. I asked him to go for a three-peat because I think he did Mono Lake, Tahoe, and now he's got Clear Lake in his district, so we'll be working that angle. No matter what, the local community has to show they're serious in order for federal money to flow, and Measure S would do that.
And just to add, and it's true we get some funding, but for the actual management of Clear Lake, whether it be monitoring, aquatic lake weed program, algae abatement efforts, we get zero funding. There's a total void of leadership at the state and federal level on this issue, I want to say across the board. And we do not get the attention that many other gyms throughout the nation get, specifically as I mentioned in my opening remarks about Lake Tahoe. And it is unfortunate. And I never thought that I personally, and if anybody wants to blame somebody for a discussion like we're having tonight about a tax, you can blame me. I never thought that I would bring an item before our board supporting a tax. I've never supported a tax in my entire career representing this community. In fact, I've voted and stood up against many tax proposals. But this is the one where I can tell you that I've stood behind it and I support it and I'll fall on the sword on it. It's never popular for anybody that's elected to support a tax, but it's because of the heart of this question is we don't get the state support. We have some funding. We've received some for the Middle Creek Restoration Project, which I think Supervisor Rushing has alluded to and speaking to, but it still requires the match. And if we can't come up with that match, that project's not going to move forward, and Jim still also touched upon that as well.
And there's also federal funding that's going to the tribes, and we are paying for cyanotoxin monitoring on the lake and water quality monitoring, erosion control projects on our shoreline, and other restoration projects. So those are all things that benefit Clear Lake as well, but it is not a lot of money.
Thank you. Next question is for Supervisor Farrington. If the state has failed to adequately help Lake County, why not give the responsibility for the lake back to the state?
Well, this is almost, I think, a loaded question, but I'll do my best. Right, the State Lands Commission, actually, the lake bed bottom is state property, if you will. We are delegated the powers of managing the lake, specifically as discussing with algae abatement activities, lake weed activities, issuance of encroachment for pier structures. Those are powers that have been delegated to us. There is a train of thought of giving the lake back to the state, but I think it would be very counterintuitive and counterproductive. If you see the state, how they manage their money and our taxpayer monies, and how dysfunctional they are, I think it would be actually more harm than good giving Clear Lake back to the state. And I can prove this by saying, look at what they've already done. Look at what they have allowed to come into our borders. They're cognizant about the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels. They're cognizant of the migration from the Great Lakes to the West Coast. They've done nothing to help prevent that other than take small steps. They help ramp up inspections at the border. They helped now implement a sticker program that is nothing but a scheme to raise money and to fund bureaucracy and administration fees at the state level. The legislature has failed us on a number of many levels, and specifically when it comes to Clear Lake. I've seen no responsibility and leadership, and this is what this issue is about. It's about a bottom-up leadership. If I saw the state leaders actually take an interest in Lake County, state representatives that actually show up here more than on election season, then I'd have different faith, and I would actually consider giving the responsibility to the state, but I don't see that. As I indicated, I see an absence, and that's what this whole measure is about, is taking local control, exercising our discretion, as Dr. Lyons said, and taking ownership of a gym that we all love.
Before you go to the next question, I just want to add, local control seems to often be an issue. And for whoever asked that question, I would suggest, look at where you don't get local control and the kind of laws that come out. They tend to be laws that are one size fits all and don't work for Lake County. And we've seen that in the air quality area. We've seen that in the transportation area. We've seen it over and over and over again where they're dealing with the whole state, and the majority of the state lives in populated areas, and so the laws that they create are for those areas. And when it comes to the rural areas, we have a very difficult time on the programs that the state manages, where they have taken the ownership role of managing things like mobile home park regulations and things like that. So it's, if you like how the state is doing things, then I guess you wouldn't want local control, but for my part, I would want to keep as much local control as we could.
Thank you. Next question. I like the idea of choke points for quagga mussel inspections on main roads entering Lake County. Have you identified areas on these roads where these inspections can be performed without disturbing traffic? And then they've got a PS. Believe me, if Clear Lake is an enjoyable destination, people will be willing to go through the checkpoints, just like going through snow chain payment checkpoints on the way to Yosemite.
The checkpoints or choke points have been something that, that I've been a very strong advocate for. And the reason being is that on the major arteries, and we have 4 major arteries, but you count coming from South County over 175 and Cobb Mountain, another potential choke point that we'd have to address. But if you look at the major arteries, you have off of Highway 1 and Highway 20, 101, Highway 20 from the Ukiah side, so both the Colusa and the Ukiah side, Hopland, and then Highway 29 out of St. Helena. The choke points to me are really the only way that we can try to inspect and or necessary quarantine or decontaminate a transient vessel that is coming into our borders, or a local resident that has taken their watercraft out and brought the watercraft back into our county. The board has explored it, and we've looked at a number of different options of how to manage and implement the program, whether it's 4 stations, 365 days out of the year, 24 hours a day, or ramping it down, if you will, to just a couple key strategic stations and open them during business hours. Doing the full 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day, knowing that people are traveling throughout the day and throughout the year, you're in excess of $1.2, $1.3 million just to put that component into place. There are a number that get to the heart of the question, locations in public right-of-way where you can have people pull over, where the inspection or initial screening can take place, and or transporting that vessel for quarantine purposes. So the answer to the question is yes, there is a number of locations in these major arteries where you can actually do the screening, the inspection, and if necessary, do the decontamination or quarantine that would allow a free flow of commerce, if you will.
I want to just add that it's $1.2 million a year to maintain those stations. It's not a one-time cost, so it would be an ongoing cost.
Thank you. Jim or Harry might want to take this next one. Is it really possible to get rid of the algae, and how about the weeds?
No. The whole system works on the algae. The food chain works on the algae. There's algae that you don't notice. It's not noxious. And the algae that is noxious, a healthy, balanced green lake will have a certain amount of them every summer. So if we decrease the nutrients, we'll decrease the algae, and we'll have some kind of balance. And Jim knows more about how to actually achieve that balance. But there is a balance. You don't get rid of the weeds. You don't get rid of the algae, ever.
True enough. Yeah, let me add to that, and Harry's right as usual. You know, it really is about managing a lot of nutrients in a high nutrient-rich lake. You want to keep as much out that's replenishing it as possible, and there is a lockup rate for phosphorus. It locks up in the soil, gets deeper. It locks up with other constituents. It won't release as during the special summer times when it's right conditions. So there's even some material that you can add, Phoslock, to actually lock up phosphorus. And so as the nutrients naturally lock up, and it doesn't go off as a gas like nitrogen does. It can go out through the dam, as I said. But as that decreases and comes to a lower level, then you have kind of a more normal, if you will. We'll have nutrients are then taking up those, we'll have plants then taking up those nutrients, and that's what's locking up the nutrient load. At the middle of this summer, we have a decrease of nitrogen to the point that it's almost deficient in the lake. And when you have a low nitrogen, high phosphorus ratio, you can almost guarantee a cyanobacteria bloom. So what you want are ratios such that it isn't put into cyanobacteria blooms where those species find themselves in a very advantageous place. You want it so that the phytoplankton, the eukaryotes, the ones that actually drive the whole ecosystem that favors us, you want them to be favored. And so we want to put back the complexity in the lake that has been taken out with the wetlands, with the rimland tules, with lower nutrient loading. And when you get all of that in place, then you're going to see that things will be balanced instead of one species taking over like that. Now, as to the aquatic weeds, the ones that grow up off the bottom, it's a real interesting phenomenon. It happens in a lot of lakes. It's because the lake is clear. Our clear lake will grow weeds off the bottom very well, thank you. But here's how it used to be. Prior to 1994, you didn't see those weeds growing there. Prior to 1994, you had very high populations of threadfin shad. The threadfin shad, trillions of them in the lake, I'm sure, used to feed down the zooplankton. The zooplankton feed on the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton levels were high. And so when the phytoplankton levels were high, you didn't get the clarity in the lake in the early spring. Right at that time, when the sunlight would reach the bottom and grow up the weeds, there was phytoplankton in the way because the zooplankton populations were so low because the fish were eating them. In 1994, there was a change. There was a cold spell came through, froze the lake, and threadfin shad, or a lower state species, come from the southern state, was introduced here as a food source. They died, and they almost disappeared out of the lake. All of a sudden, zooplankton increased to tremendous numbers. They would feed down on the phytoplankton. You've seen clear conditions in Clear Lake ever since. And so, yes, you can manipulate this a little bit by bringing up all the weeds, all the tules around the rimland again. Why, that would be wonderful population centers for small hitch, small fish, and they would feed on the zooplankton, which will allow a higher phytoplankton population, less sunlight on the bottom during that critical springtime when the sunlight would hit the bottom and raise the plants up. Okay, now, phytoplankton is increasing. Plants don't grow off the bottom, and as the phytoplankton increases, you'll never get them off the bottom. And in fact, there's been some schemes in some lakes where they go in early in the spring and they stir up the bottom just to make sure that there's no sunlight reaching it, and therefore you don't grow the weeds. We can't do that because we have the hydraulic. But you can see how you can start to maneuver this whole thing by just increasing the rimland tules, and you're going to see a response.
I'm going to add, I'm not sure we totally answered. I know we answered the question. I just want to sum it up. The question, I think the underlying question was, will this money really make a difference? And the answer to that is yes, because we have a dominant species that will become a background species again, and that's the Lingbia. It's become a dominant species. It needs to fade into the background with a balanced, healthy lake.
That's why you're an engineer.
Thank you. So what I got from that is, unlike Uncle Bruce, weeds and algae do not ever eventually go away. That's correct. And we don't want them to, unlike Uncle Bruce.
Some of that algae has been there for millions and millions of years.
Next question. What's the difference between measures S and L? Who wants to take that one?
Sure, I'll take that. When Measure L didn't pass and we lost by 220 votes or something like that, we had a very quick turnaround to be able to get it on the ballot this time around. And so the thought was, is there anything that can be addressed that people, that the general public had said, we still have a problem with this. And actually Measure L we also did it with Measure L. What were the things that people in this county said was a problem with Measure E, and how can we change that so it can be something that everyone can live with? So with Measure S, the changes from the previous measure, which is Measure L, was on the Oversight Committee, and it was also on the Aquatic Invasive Species Program. So with the Oversight Committee, Measure L had language in it that said that the Oversight Committee would be made up potentially of groups of people, committees that already existed, the cities, so it was a lot more specific about who could be on it. Although it was still a recommendation, it wasn't set in stone. It was something that bothered people. They said, it feels like it's being set up already. And that was a really easy fix, because really the intention of Measure L was to provide a committee made up of concerned citizens who were county residents who would be able to come together and make recommendations on how to spend this money each year. And so the way that Measure S is written, the changes are that the actual language is, an oversight committee shall be established, and its membership will be open to representatives of the distinct geographic areas around the county, including the towns, cities, and tribal lands. So that's slightly different in that it's just opening it up anywhere. The next thing is that the committee would meet quarterly as opposed to just once a year, and that is it actually increases the function of the Oversight Committee. The language in Measure S is, the Oversight Committee's functions are to review the annual proposed expenditure plan, analyze actual expenditures, and make recommendations to the Board of Supervisors on needed expenditure adjustments. It also says that another change from Measure L is that there will be no more than 15 members, and I believe Measure L had 11 or something. And a staggered system will be created to have ongoing membership. That wasn't in Measure L. Just so that we can have, because members shall serve for no longer than 2 terms. So that's another change, is that it's actually saying it's going to be open so that over time you're not going to have a dominance of one particular person or a few people, but that there's going to be some new fresh thinking as time goes on during the 10 years that Measure S is going to be collecting money. So it makes it, what we see as the improvement of it is that it makes it more open in terms of who could be on it, and it creates a structure so that there's not, there's a turnover in a staggered way so that you have some new fresh thinking on the committee. The other thing I just want to point out about that is that this committee is serving to look at how the money can be spent each year. And you're talking about adaptive management, and the question for Jim earlier, and this is about that each year there might be different conditions in the lake that the funding really should be spent on. And this Measure S is very flexible in that way. You know, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's just suggestions on how to spend the money in terms of the fixed programs that are written into the ordinance. So the flexibility is key because each year we have a different situation. The other component of the other change between Measure L and Measure S, let's see if I can find the exact language, I might not be able to, but it is to reiterate that the concept of gates or ramp controls are just one option. And even though that was the case in Measure L for aquatic invasive species control or quagga mussel control, it is only an option. We changed the language so it became more clear that it is still only an option. It's something that the Oversight Committee is actually going to be making their recommendations on to the Board of Supervisors. We're going to have public hearings. The Oversight Committee's meetings are open to the public, which means that there will be public comment periods during it. And then when it goes before the Board of Supervisors, there will also be public comment period for that, because it's a public hearing. So the language change is just so that to reiterate that gates are an option, just like hiring people to run the ramps is an option, just like choke points are an option. Any of those things that can improve the quagga mussel program is an option. So those are the two changes.
Thank you. It's just a little after 8 o'clock. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions really quickly, and then we'll go to a panel summation. How will this tax help get rid of the cyanobacteria when the chemical fluoridone, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, that is used to kill hydrilla causes lower oxygen levels and makes algae bloom?
Can I talk about that a little bit? There are multiple chemicals that are used on the lake. Fluoridone is just one of them. So I'm not sure why the person who wrote that question pointed out fluoridone. But the money that, you know, the algal control component of Measure S is that there are various options in short-term fixes and long-term solutions that Measure S can fund. The short-term fixes, and it's things that we're doing at Big Valley Rancheria. We aerate our shoreline at Big Valley Rancheria, and we do that by using a water pump. And it was actually it was a variation of what the county came up with when we were first dealing with cyanobacteria blooms on the lake. We have a water pump and a fire hose, and we're pulling in water from the lake and spraying it right back out to the lake. That is aerating the area, and it keeps it livable. It's a short-term fix. It is not a solution, but it keeps it livable. And when we do cyanotoxin monitoring in those areas, we're also not seeing an increase in cyanotoxin monitoring, cyanotoxin levels. Matter of fact, we have lower levels because the blooms never get too big in the areas where we're doing our aeration. So yes, lower oxygen is something that we're concerned about along the shoreline, and we do tend to see higher cyanotoxin areas along the shoreline where we're monitoring, and not in the center of the lake, but in the shoreline areas. But you know, the aeration program is something that could potentially be funded in areas. The county has already put some money into it to do aeration, so I just see it as, you know, additional funding is something that is needed to have circulation and aeration programs for short-term fixes in the key areas around the lake, in the areas where you have a lot of recreation and boating, and that's yeah, fluoridone is definitely one of the chemicals that affects the lake, but there's multiple chemicals that do it. So we need to look at kind of a larger picture of improving the lake water quality. The long-term fixes are that we do watershed restoration and erosion control projects, so we reduce the amount of nutrient loading that's actually feeding the cyanobacteria.
Thank you, Sarah. Next question is about mussels inspection. Is the mussel inspection that's, I guess, proposed to be used, is this based on visual inspection? Can mussels get through that are too small based on visual inspection alone?
Yeah, actually I've gone down for the level 2 inspection course in Lake Mead, where they do an intensive training on how to find these mussels and where they are in the boat, and how to flush hot water through the boat and whatever's necessary in order to determine which boat is a high risk or a low risk. Some boats are just a very high risk, and you can't let them into the lake because you can't inspect them. You have to quarantine them for up to 30 days or longer, depending on the temperature and that sort of thing of the outside air. You want a clean, dry, drain boat. That's basically what you're looking for, because if it is clean, drain, dry, it has the less chance of the mussel. That doesn't mean it has no mussels. One of the reasons for that is that if someone cleans their boat as it comes out of the lake, and it comes here very quickly, it hasn't been out of the water long enough for it to dry out in all of the internal spaces. And so it may look clean, drain, and dry on the outside, but the internal spaces could be wet. So what we really need to have is time on trailer. That's the fourth component of this, clean, drain, dry, time on trailer. I've tried to introduce this. We wrote a paper about it, sent it to several of the federal people. They liked it. They wanted to try to institute it. It's still in the works. Federal government employees really are following the lead from the left coast, or the left coast, the right coast, east, and the wrong coast. And so we don't get much traction out here, but I would like to see California step up to the plate. Once you put a boat on a trailer and cable it down, you can actually then use some time element for its travel by the time it gets here. If it's been on the trailer 3 days to a week or longer before we want to launch it here, we know that we got a clean, drain, dry boat by inspection, and we also have time on trailer. And that's when the internal spaces are drying up and are not good for the mussels. So that's the one element I'd like to see added, but it is by inspection. It is also by knowing the boats. If you know the boats, some boats are easier to inspect, and so those are easy. You just go out and look for the key things. Other boats are harder to inspect. What might they be? How about the wakeboard boats, where they have internal bladders where they make the boat heavy? That's a boat that you don't want to have come into the lake until you've had the bladders out, you've had the boat totally inspected in all the small places. Some of the bass boats that they're building now are better for inspection. One of the things that we did is we put together a scorecard for rating boats. The boat that is the most likely to carry around mussels for the longest period would have the highest number, and the boat that would carry them around for the lowest period would have the lowest number. And then a zero boat, you could put it in Lake Mead for 2 years and it would never pick up a mussel. And we tried to sell that to the state so that we could encourage the manufacturers of boats to come up with boats that would not transport invasive species. And we couldn't even get that across to them. So there's a lot of work to be done here. Lake County is actually in the lead with some of the work that it has done and some of the publications. We're actually done some studies at UNLV, University of Las Vegas, on how to approach the mussel if it did get in the lake. And by using certain pumps and sediment off the bottom, you can clog them up so that they don't get a head start. That would have a problem with blowing around a lot of the weeds that we don't want to have blowing around and mercury off the bottom. So there's a lot of problems to solve, but there's a lot of methods to solve it. So it is by inspection, and that's about what we have, knowing the boats, making sure that when they come in from somewhere, know where they came from, know how long they've been trailered, and then have some knowledge about the mussel itself. And so there's courses to be taught. And the trainers would have to know all this stuff, or the people that inspect would have to know all this.
Thank you. That's going to end the question and answer session. If you didn't get your question asked tonight, please stick around afterwards. We should be able to get somebody to answer your question, either from the Save the Lake Committee or maybe one of the panelists. Now we're going to just move into the panel summations. This is the time when each of you gets to just sum up any thoughts after tonight's forum. I want to start with Anthony. Oh, Dr. Lamb. Okay, we're going to reverse order.
I think that the issue in using natural resources is one of balancing freedom to and freedom from. And so we want the freedom to use the lake in any way we wish. We have to keep track of freedom from it changing to something that's not all that usable. I think that it's exciting when local communities with local funds start to wisely manage natural resources. It's very exciting and uplifting, and I'm glad to be here. And somebody else said that Lake County was at the forefront. And that happens more often than an outsider would think. In viticulture, in education, and now in natural resource management. We are small, but we can be very smart. Thanks.
Thank you. Sarah?
I would like to just reiterate that Measure S is a really wonderful combination of flexibility that can change the expenditure in the program each year because of the Oversight Committee's recommendations. And it also is a combination of short-term fixes and long-term solutions, which I think is what you need when you have people who live on the lake and they have recreation needs and ceremonial needs and needs that have to be kind of solved right then. But it also has that component of it which where the money can be spent on things that will give us a long-term perspective and a longer-term fix on the lake. This is something that doesn't exist right now. What I've noticed is the county's programs tend to be really kind of putting out fires because there's not a lot of money to deal with it. And when you don't have you don't have the right funding, you end up doing a lot of short-term fixes and you can't ever really do the long-term solutions. As a watershed manager myself, I know that I've seen firsthand that long-term solutions are something that you need to plan for, that you need the right amount of funding for, and will end up being reaping positive results. But you do also want to have those short-term things so people can use the lake and have have it be something that can be enjoyed on a regular basis, so we can see the economic benefits from it as well as just the personal satisfaction that comes from being able to use the lake. So I would just like to reiterate that I think it's a great program and it's something that should be funded. It's not something that is going to break our bank, and I hope that everyone votes for it.
Thank you. Denise?
I guess I'll start by saying that Lake County has already proven that a majority of its residents want this, but we don't need a majority, we need a super majority. And a super majority is 66.7% of the people in the county. And so if and when this passes, it will be because we have educated everyone about how important this is to us. In the ecological design world, one of the things that I love is that there's a concept called least change for the greatest effect. Least change for the greatest effect means if you put your energy into that one thing, it will have a ripple effect. This measure is that. It has a ripple effect. We change this, we turn this lake around, we turn our economy around. People remember the heyday. We turn our economy around. And who knows, maybe as a result of this moment in time, future generations will look back at this time and they will say that is when they turned it around. That's when they began. And Lake County has a bright future ahead of it, and I believe it begins with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
I want to talk about the management for a second. My 40 years in natural resource as a scientist for the state, one of the things that I've seen as far as change is concerned, timber harvests become more professionally managed for the forests and for the wildlife, so it's a kind of a common use for everyone, even on private lands and Forest Service land. So professional managers learned how to do this, and they turned that around. Mining was the same way. They did turn that around where they were polluting streams and were going back to restore streams and restore mines and put them to bed. It's done quite differently today. Natural lake management is the same way. When you have a impounded reservoir with a dam, it's not quite the problem that it is with a natural lake. They're shallow, they have a lot of nutrients, they have turnover in such a way that, and they're long-lived in such a way that it can create a long-term problem. So you have to have professional management. Professional management now is at a level where limnology is such that you can look at watershed, wetland, rimland, and aquatic systems as a unit. I can remember when I started, we thought that one didn't drive the other. That's how much has changed over 40 years. It all drives each other, and it's all connected. It's all flowing with gravity. It all comes downhill. It goes into the lake. This is a headwaters lake. It will leave the lake going down to the next place. But this headwaters lake collects from 450 square miles. And yes, you have to manage that, or you're not going to get a good result.
Thank you. Anthony?
Well, I think everyone here this evening, you've consumed and listened to a lot of us stating and providing a lot of information. I'll keep it very brief in my summation. This measure has evolved to what I think is a better measure, albeit it's not perfect. There's no body of law that any legislation is adopted either at the local or state or federal level, and either by initiative. There's nothing that's perfect. And in fact, if you want to find fault with anything, if you are a detractor or you're just adamant against any type of taxes, you're always going to find fault with something. And this is something that you could find fault with, just like any legislation. But it's a culmination of a group of bodies of the city of Clear Lake and their representation, the city of Lakeport and their elected representation, our board of supervisors, the public, and a very diverse group that I have never seen sit around the same table together and put a body of law before the electorate. You have the Sierra Club working on this legislation and supporting. You have the Chamber of Commerce's, Clear Lake and Lake County Chamber of Commerce's. You have the Farm Bureau. You have the realtors. You have a Republican local elected officials. You have Democrats. You have declined to state. You have Republicans, libertarians, even vegetarians that are working to support this legislation here locally and put it before the electorate. I've never, in my years going back to the 90s when I first interned at the Capitol and worked for the President of the Senate, David Roberti, and to this point in time, I've never seen a diverse body of opinions, ideologies, principles, and creeds pushing for a measure, knowing that it's very hard on the backdrop of competing with state initiatives, other local tax initiatives. When I first campaigned with Measure E, it was myself and a treasurer. And I had some help with the Lake County Association of Realtors with locations of signs. And I'm very appreciative to this day of the leadership that they have shown in this endeavor. But even then, we didn't fathom with Measure E, the first measure, that we would garner over 50%. We thought it would be close. In an 8 to 9 week campaign, it garnered 63% of the vote. And the numbers that come in, and I'll leave you with this as food for thought, is that even in South County, Cobb Mountain, and other communities at large, some communities that don't even see the lake on a daily basis, they pulled for this measure. They understand the flow of commerce. They understand that this is an asset, a gem that attracts people. And whether you're in business, whether you're a property owner, whether you love the environment, the fisheries, the wildlife, or you're into recreational aspects such as fishing and boating, this lake is truly why we're here. And it's what brought me back home. And I know that in my years of service, if I did not take this stand and work with my colleagues and these other panelists and other groups, that I didn't do my job. Not only as an electorate, I say this as a citizen. And I'm willing to pay my fair share. And I hope that each and every one of you will consider it. We're not going to be locking up the lake. The scare tactics have a effectiveness, and I just hope that you'll do your research, and if we don't answer the questions here, that every one of you have the opportunity to reach out to us and really get the facts. So once again, I thank you all for your time, and for those that are undecided, I thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you. Shared a lot of great information here tonight. Thank you to the Save the Lake Committee who sponsored this event, and to the Soper Reese who offered us a great venue. Thank you to all of you who attended. Have a wonderful evening.